Welcome to this episode of Outside Fun, where I'll be turning maple sap into maple syrup. In the previous episode, I showed you how to select the right maple tree and also how to properly tap it. If you'd like to see that, simply click on the link that will be appearing now. I wanted the collected sap to stay as cool as possible, so after tapping the trees, I heaped snow around the containers, and I placed garbage bags over them to keep the sunlight out. I did this because I knew that sap can only keep for a week in cool temperatures. I also knew that I wouldn't be able to get back to collect and boil the sap until a week later. During this time, there were a few good nights below zero and a few days above zero. So, after a week of collection from 6 maple trees, I had about 13 gallons of sap. When I returned with my friend Jeff to collect the sap and boil it down, the weather had turned cold again after a week of warm weather. The sap won't flow in weather like this, but we knew that we'd still have a good amount of sap from the previous warm days. After trudging through the storm and dragging the sap to our impromptu sugar shack, it was time to begin. First thing is to get a good fire going and allow it time to establish a bed of coals. Now, if you don't have access to firewood, you can always use your barbecue to boil the sap down. But be warned, you're going to spend a lot of money on propane. Also, don't try to boil your sap down on your kitchen stove, not unless you want your walls and ceiling to be permanently sticky. So my advice? Use wood fire and do it outside. Once we got the fire going, we turned our attention to filtering the ice out of the sap. This is a helpful tip. It's better to throw away the ice than to boil it. That's because the sugar content keeps maple sap from freezing, so the part that does freeze doesn't have enough sugar in it anyway to be worth your time trying to boil off. So, by discarding the ice, you're helping to speed up the process just a little more. I used a roasting pan and lobster pot to boil the sap down. Why? Because they're what I had on hand. But the general rule is that the more surface area you have, the faster your sap will boil down. So though the roasting pan and the lobster pot have about the same capacity, the roasting pan will boil the sap faster. Now that the sap is boiling over a roaring fire, all you have to do is add more wood to the fire when the flames go down, and more sap to the pots when the liquid goes down. Also, don't forget to skim off the impurities from time to time. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and settle in for a full day of boiling. Just try not to fall asleep. Time for lunch. On a cold day in the bush, there's nothing like a hot plate of beanies and weenies and a cup of coffee. on the bottom there. Nice and burnt. Burnt beans. Smoke. Oh, I never told you what flavor these beans were.
Maple?
Yes. I thought it was in spirit of season. Many people wonder what sap looks and tastes like. As you can see, it looks just like water, and it tastes a lot like water too, with an almost indiscernible hint of sweetness to it. It's really not all that exciting in this form. Remember, the ratio is 40:1, so it'll take time for the 40 plus liters of sap that we collected to transform into just over 1 liter of Canada's finest liquid gold. At first, you'll notice that the sap will boil down quickly, but as the mixture becomes more concentrated, it will turn from crystal clear to a murky amber, and it will boil down slower. After 5 to 6 hours of boiling, we had all 13 gallons of sap reduced to about 2 gallons. The daylight was fading, so we decided to pull the pots off the fire. Then we set them in the snow to cool. After they had cooled for a bit, we poured the remaining sap into a jug to take home. At this point, the sap doesn't look all that appetizing, but wait till you see the finished product. I stuck the jug containing our 2 liters of sap outside in the snow for the night. The next day, I took the sap inside to finish boiling on the stove. I used a cheesecloth to filter the sap into a pot. Inevitably, bits of ash from the fire and other particles will get into the sap over the course of it boiling down, and so this is where you'll need to filter them out. I chose to finish the sap on the stove because it's easier to regulate the heat, and at this stage the sap needs to be carefully babysitted or else the whole batch could be burnt and ruined. But let me warn you again, even at this stage it is possible to make your kitchen sticky by boiling sap on the stove. However, I turned the stove fan on full blast and I used a second fan to help disperse the vapor. Lucky for me, I didn't end up with a sticky kitchen. But if I had to recommend the best method for finishing your sap, it'd probably be over a barbecue at this stage. But if you prefer, it is still entirely possible to finish the batch off over a wood fire. In any case, this is the time to keep a close eye on the temperature of the sap. As the sap continues to boil down, it will change from a murky amber to a caramel color, and it will begin to give off that unmistakable maple smell. You will know that your maple syrup is done when it reaches 7 to 7.5 degrees above boiling. As you can see, my sap comes to a rolling boil at exactly 210 Fahrenheit. So that means I'll need to pull the pot off the stove when the candy thermometer reads at 217. Depending on your elevation, the sap may boil at a different temperature, and your target temperature will therefore be different. Here you can see that I'm only a few degrees off my maple syrup mark. I found that once the syrup gets to within 5 degrees of the target temperature, it won't be much longer before it's done. At this point, the syrup needs your undivided attention. It would be a shame to burn the batch now. So this is where I put the camera down to focus on the task at hand. Once the syrup hits the target temperature, I took the pot off the burner and let it cool for at least a few hours. After letting the syrup cool, I filtered it through a cheesecloth about 3 times to remove the remaining impurities. After boiling it, it's best to keep your maple syrup in the fridge. So, to recap, I collected 13 gallons of maple sap, which made about 1.2 liters of maple syrup. It took about 5.5 hours to boil the sap down to 2 gallons, and it took about another 3.5 hours to finish boiling it on the stove. It was a lot of work, but after tasting the maple syrup, it was all worth it. And who can complain after having an excuse to be outside all day, sit in front of a fire, and chat with a friend while sipping on a cup of coffee? I might be a little biased here, but I think that maple syrup made by your own hands will be the best maple syrup that you'll ever taste. I know it's true with me. Anyway, I want to thank all of you, my fellow outsiders, for joining me on my maple syrup quest. I am the outsider, saying, until next time.